I have my first update. I just finished chapter 2, so I'm about to start chapter 3 on page 66. These are long ass chapters, let me tell you that much. In this book, we follow a group of 4 friends. They used to live together during college, and now we're following them post-grad as they go out into the real world. And these are very average people. There's nothing special about them. They're kind of making their way through middle to lower class. So we are introduced to JB, Malcolm, Willem, and Jude. This book is mostly about Jude, but so far we haven't got anything from his perspective. We don't know a lot about him. We just kind of know little glimpses of what he's like from the other 3 guys. So the first one I'm going to talk about is JB, and I took notes on my phone because this book is very character heavy and there's a lot of detail about each guy. So my first thoughts is that JB is an asswipe who thinks he's the shit, and the females in his life treat him as so. They think he's like God's greatest gift to earth, and they just shower him in compliments and really boost his ego. He's also an aspiring artist, and he's just kind of rude. I don't know if rude's the right word, but he's very confident in what he does and wants to come across that way, and he kind of is the leader of the group, I would say. Next we have Malcolm, and he comes from a pretty rich, wealthy family, and he still lives at home at the age of 28, and this really shakes his self-confidence, and he doesn't feel good enough in anything that he does because his family often compares him to his older sister Flora. Jude actually lived with Malcolm for a little bit in the basement apartment that was Flora's before she moved out, and this takes place a little bit before our timeline in the book, where now Jude and Willem have moved in together. Malcolm also really struggles with his race and how he fits into the world because he has a black father and a white mother. And then moving on to Willem, he is a struggling actor who also waits on the side, is a server on the side, works as a waiter, and he is also in the in-between right now. He's not really succeeding in his acting career, and he's not super happy with being a server. He also grew up with a brother who had cerebral palsy, and he actually passed away. But Willem is very understanding and caring, and he seems very level-headed and sees things as they are. And I think so him and Jude have moved in together into this new apartment, and we don't know much about Jude. We just know he's in pain a lot of the time. He's pretty closed off, pretty serious. So far, not much has happened. We've just gotten a lot of background about the characters and how they've kind of ended up where they are as of right now, but I'm sure we're going to find out a lot more. I would hope so, because this is a hefty book, but it's kind of slow. I know it's building up, but the writing so far is really beautiful. There's a lot of side notes added to the book, which I appreciate, and kind of foreshadowing. So far, nothing heavy has happened. We haven't really dived too deep into Jude's past, because I think his past is where a lot of trauma happens. But these guys are just very average and normal, and nothing too exceptional about them. They've all ended up at the same place. The only one who has an advantage, I would say, is Malcolm, because he is quite wealthy and doesn't have to struggle with the money aspect, but he does struggle with a lot of other things in his life. We do go into a little bit about what the 4 main things is that he does struggle with, and he doesn't like feeling like he's relying on his parents for everything and that they're paving the way for him. Because this isn't a very action-heavy book, I can't sit down and read huge chunks of it at a time, because it's just very much learning about each character and their personality and who they are and what makes them them. So it is heavy in that sense right now, because we're not really getting anywhere. We're just learning a lot. I have made it to page 108, and just a little recap from the last little bit. We get a better understanding of how much pain Jude is in. We see more of his episodes, I guess what you would call them. He also has his first bout of self-harm that we see, and he asks Willem to drive him to Andy's. Andy is a doctor that Jude really trusts, and pretty much the only guy, or the only doctor he'll go and see. But he just tells Willem that he cut his arm, but Andy knows there's something more going on, and so does Willem, because about 8 years in the past from right now. Willem had kind of suspected that Jude might be suffering with self-harm just because of how he acts, and in the summer he was only wearing long sleeve shirts no matter how hot it was. He kind of wishes he brought something up sooner, but even after he realizes that Jude is self-harming, he doesn't have a conversation with him. He kind of just leaves it as it is and doesn't push or prod or poke too much because he doesn't want to push Jude like over the edge, and they don't really have uncomfortable conversations. They're just this mutual understanding between them that things are happening, but neither of them talk about it. And then we move into part 2, and in this part, it only refers to Jude as he, like the narrator never mentions him by name. The only time we hear Jude's name is if like another character is talking about him. We learn he grew up in a monastery, it's briefly mentioned, and there is also reference to brother Michael and brother Luke. We also find out that the pain that Jude is going through is because of a car injury, and it is specifically said a car injury, not a car accident. We don't know the details of it yet, but his back is what causes these episodes. But after his car accident, he is introduced to the social worker Anna, and Anna is a gem, even though she is only in his life for 14 months because she inevitably passes away due to an illness. I don't think it was said exactly what it was, maybe cancer. But in those short 14 months, she really genuinely cares about Jude and his well-being, and she is the one who pushes him to go to college and to pursue an education. Even though she was assigned to him after his accident and she does know what happens, she never hears it directly from Jude himself because he doesn't really want to talk about it. And again, she doesn't push him to talk about uncomfortable things either. There's kind of just this mutual understanding between them that shitty things have happened and they both know what happened, but it doesn't have to be spoken aloud. And even on her deathbed, she wishes she pushed Jude more to talk about it, to get him used to the idea of talking about uncomfortable things and things that have had happened to him. And she really gets across the message that what he went through wasn't his fault. So obviously it was something pretty big that traumatized Jude. We still don't know what it is, but I've just noticed between Willem and Anna, they don't really push Jude to talk about things. They just kind of accept it for what it is, that good or bad. And they kind of just leave it up to Jude to bring up things as he wants. We still don't know much about Jude's past at all, like what happened to his parents or like what ethnicity he is really. It's kind of like, he's just kind of a gray character. We don't really know too much about him other than he is in law school. He tutors a little antisocial kid named Felix who has no friends and is in excruciating amounts of pain for most of his life. Anyways, I will check back in when something else happens. I have finished part 2, which ends on page 210. So picking up from where we left off, we are now introduced to Harold and Julie. Harold is Jude's professor turned friend. They build this friendship. Harold takes a liking to Jude, and Jude is slowly starting to trust him more and more and takes a fondness to him. Harold and Julie and Julie is Harold's wife, and they both really care about Jude and just want to see him do well, and they're very motherly and fatherly to him. Even though they're not like a huge age gap between them, they take on that more parental role of Jude and make sure he's looked after. Even when Jude moved away, they both made a really big effort to keep in touch with him and to stop by and see him if they were in the city. That being said, they always just made sure they really clearly showed Jude that they cared about him and that they wanted to be a part of his life. Even though he doubted them every step of the way, he was always questioning whether they were going to leave him, like when they were going to leave, what was he going to do to push them away? Was he going to be a disappointment to them? That's a big factor that keeps coming up, is how much of a disappointment he thinks he's gonna be. Jude and Harold are joking around, and Jude accidentally breaks a mug of Jacob's, who I think is Harold's son. And Jude is like very guilt-ridden by this, feels very badly about what happened, and is profusely apologizing. And this wrecks him. Like, he takes it so personally, and he thinks that's gonna be like the breaking point for Harold, and that he just Jude just wants to leave. He wants to run away from it, and he just thinks that is what is going to cause the divide between them. Then we pick up with Andy, and he is really pushing Jude to go see a therapist and to talk to someone about his mental health and his self-harm, and to help him kind of go through what he did go through in his past. And like, Andy just doesn't feel like he is equipped to help Jude work through his trauma, and he is adamant about Jude going to see a therapist, but obviously Jude doesn't budge. He doesn't want to, so he doesn't. Andy lectures him over and over again, but it's like talking to a brick wall. Like, Jude just doesn't really care. And then we finally learn more about Jude and when he was at the monastery with the brothers. So we learned that he was actually found beside a trash bin by one of the brothers and then taken into the monastery. And the brothers told him that they tried to get him through the system and like up for adoption, but no one wanted him. So then he was left with the brothers, and they were awful to him. Like, they were complete assholes, and that is an understatement. Jude was into petty theft. He would like steal crackers and pens and paper, and then one day he stole a lighter, and that was kind of the catalyst of the abuse going forward. His hand was covered in oil, and then one of the brothers took that lighter and lit his hand on fire until he was like burning through his flesh. And then it kind of just snowballed after that with the physical abuse. They were doing like full naked examinations of Jude to make sure he wasn't stealing anything else. They were hitting him, they were beating him, they were screaming at him. And this was happening multiple times a day. And he was being beat until he would go unconscious. And that's when he found a lot of peace being in the blackness and where things could happen to him, but he wasn't aware of it. And from that came a lot of self-harm, emotional distress, and he started to wet the bed. And then that bedwetting was actually turned into a form of punishment even further than that. Like, he was made to wear his like urine-soaked clothes and wasn't allowed to change and had to stay in his bed, which is really awful for a little kid like who is so traumatized that they're wetting the bed, and then that's used as even more punishment. There was a brother named Brother Luke, and he wasn't necessarily like super kind to Luke, but he wasn't cruel. Like, he would kind of be gentle, offering some encouraging words, and just didn't partake in the abuse. And kind of closing out this memory, Brother Luke takes Jude to a greenhouse, and then Jude in the present says nothing was ever right since then. So obviously something really life-changing happened in that greenhouse, but we don't know the details of it yet. And then chapter 2 is from Harold's POV, and I think it's some sort of letter to Willem, just kind of recounting Harold and Jude's relationship and how Harold feels like he failed Jude, and how he really, really, truly appreciated him and loved him. And then we move on to chapter 3, and it starts off with Jude cutting off contact with JB. There's also a sore that keeps reappearing on Jude's leg. Like, it'll heal for a bit and then it'll open up again. And then that sore actually sends him back to see Andy, and he now uses a wheelchair periodically. And a little glimmer of hope for Jude, Harold and Julie approach him asking if he would become a part of their family, if they can legally adopt him. And Jude is so excited this is happening. Like, he has dreamt of having parents forever, and now he is finally going to be a part of a family and have parents of his own. But Jude went into this conversation thinking that Harold and Julie didn't want to see him anymore. Like, the complete opposite of what happened. He thought that they were like cutting off ties with him, that they no longer wanted to be his friend, when in actuality they were asking him to join their family. Like, the highest praise of friendship you can get. When Jude was younger, he was almost adopted. He went on like a trial run for a weekend with a family, and they like pumped him full of confidence that after the weekend was over, he'd go back to the home, and then on Monday they'd like kind of get the ball rolling for the adoption process. And then Monday came around, nothing. Tuesday, Wednesday, same thing. Nothing ever came of it. And Jude doesn't know why. Like, they never gave him any closure about why they weren't going to go through with the adoption, if it was something he did or if it was something that changed on their end. So he always kind of blamed himself, and he never knew if it was something because of him that the adoption didn't go through. 4 weeks before the adoption is set to place, and that Harold, Julia, and I think I've been calling her Julie. Her name is Julia. I am so sorry. Harold, Julia, and Jude are set to be in court. Jude is a wreck. Like, he is so anxious. He is so unsettled and unnerved about what is happening. So he starts self-harming even more severely than ever before, cutting more often, more deeply, and he's not eating. He's like starving himself. So that ends him. So he ends up making an appointment with Andy. And during one of their discussions, Andy doesn't give him shit about any of this. He's still persistent in Jude going to see a therapist, but with no luck, obviously. But we do find out that Jude has contracted a bunch of STDs. Not much more is said about this. We kind of move on to a next scene. That's one thing I've noticed about this book, is that it talks about one event and then it kind of moves to the past, and then you get caught up to date again, and you kind of ebb and flow between a bunch of different timelines. But none of the timelines are saw through completely in one telling. It's just bits and pieces here and there, until you finally get through enough pages to see a big full picture. So that being said, now that we're all caught up to date on some of Jude's past, the adoption finally happens. It goes through, everything goes really well, and this part kind of wraps up with Jude being surrounded by his best friends, the four of them. He's talking to JB again. So it's JB, Willem, Malcolm, and Jude. They're all hanging out together at Julia and Harold's, and he's just very content with what has happened, with where his life is at now. And he's confiding in Willem like how happy he is, and Willem is also being really supportive, saying like, you should have seen Harold's face, how delighted he was that now you're a part of the family. It's a very sweet moment between them. So part 2 ended off on a good note. We're gonna get into part 3. It is several days later now, and we are going to recap part 3 and 4. I have so many notes on my phone right now. Okay, so part 3, we start off with chapter 1, and it is from Willem's POV. He's getting his acting career going, and he's starting to become a little bit more famous and more recognizable. He's really struggling with the balance of being Jude's friend and looking after and supporting him, but not being overbearing and too much of like a doctor and like spying on him and keeping tabs of his like self-harm. So he doesn't know how to treat him like a friend, but also be supportive and make sure he's not doing anything to hurt himself, and like not lecturing him too. That's the biggest thing. And then we move on to chapter 2. And this is like a little bit more of a lighter chapter. Like, it kind of proves that not everything is bad in Jude's life. Like, he makes partner at his new firm. And this law firm is very prestigious. It's a very high-end law firm, and like very successful people work there. Like, it's a big, intimidating office. And 2 days before that job offer comes through, there is that sore on Jude's leg that has opened up again, so he's actually back using a wheelchair. And while he is wheelchair bound, the elevator at his apartment actually breaks down, so that is just like pushing him to find a new place to live, because he literally has to drag himself up the stairs to his apartment. And I think he lives on like the 5th or 6th floor, so it's not just like up a flight of stairs. This chapter heavily focuses on Jude's legal career and his life as a lawyer and trying to find his space in the legal field. And just when things don't look super great, he actually finds an apartment in like this big industrial building with a guy named Richard that he knows. So he hires Malcolm to help renovate it, and it has a very reliable elevator because it is like a big industrial building. And then we move on to chapter 3, and we get JB's POV, and when he is really struggling with his drug use, and it like starts right off the bat saying like he's not an addict, like he's not addicted like all of his friends, when in reality he probably is. But JB does want to get clean from drugs, so he calls Jude up and asks if Jude will go into the apartment and get rid of everything, like flush it all down. Like, he tells Jude where his like crack pipe is, where all the substances are, so he gets him to go in there and completely clean it out. And Jude does do that because he's a good friend and like very caring and affectionate towards JB. Not affectionate, Jude doesn't really show a bunch of affection, but in his own way he's affectionate. JB ends up running into Jackson, that asshole of a friend that I mentioned earlier. And Jude's like, come on, JB, like, we're not doing this. We're not getting with Jackson. Like, he is addicted and will get you back onto the drugs. Like, come on, let's go. Like, just forget him. But Jackson's very convincing, and JB ends up going back to his apartment with Jackson, and they get very high on cocaine. And Jackson does an awful interpretation of Jude, and JB knows it's wrong, but he doesn't tell him to stop. And keep this in the back of your mind for later. And then Jude, Malcolm, and Willem all show up at JB's apartment one day and find him severely like hungover and like coming down from the drugs. And they want to see him clean and sober. Like they want to see him in his best, and they know he can get there. So they show up. I think they take him to the hospital even. Oh no, they didn't take him to the hospital, but like they kind of start lecturing him, and JB gets very defensive and very upset, thinking they're all like being pitted against him. And he does that same imitation that Jackson did of Jude, and like in front of Jude, in front of all of the friends, and Jude takes that very harshly. But Willem quite literally punches JB's lights out, and that's what sends him to the hospital. And then once JB wakes up again, he like looks over and Jude is sitting there in a chair. But after that event, JB and Jude, and inevitably Willem, because Willem always sides with Jude, they are not friends anymore. Like after that, what JB did, like the interpretation of him, just kind of confirmed to Jude that everyone sees him the way he feared they did, and that all of his insecurities are actually on display, and that's how people see him, weak and deformed and just, yeah, not what he thought he was putting out there. And to see one of his friends do that about him really hurt. Obviously it would hurt anyone. So JB, Jude, and Willem, Willem and Jude only see JB at group events, and they're like cordial. They're not very friendly, but they're pretty civil with each other. And then we move on to part 4, and this is where shit gets real. This is like a very heavy part. It took me several days to get through. I think there's like 3 chapters here, but it took me a long time to get through it just because a lot happens. So as we know from this book, Jude has never really had a relationship with anyone, and then he goes to a party and meets this guy named Caleb. Caleb seems really interested in him, like they hit it off, they have really good conversation during this dinner party, and Caleb gets Jude's number and then they start seeing each other. Caleb is a total asshole, and I don't know if there was ever like a label to their relationship. They were just like hanging out, seeing each other, going for dinner, stuff like that. But as soon as Caleb sees him, like for the first time outside of that dinner party, he is a complete asshole. Like he is telling Jude that he walks weird, that he doesn't like his wheelchair, and that if he had known Jude had a limp when they first met, he might have not wanted to see him anymore, or wouldn't have asked him out and to see it and to get his number. And Caleb literally tells him, like, you and your wheelchair embarrasses me, and it makes you look weak, like you're not actually strong, like you're just succumbing to your illness, like come on, like you don't need your wheelchair, like don't use it in front of me. And when Jude is going through an episode, he falls and Caleb literally hits him, like hits a man while he's down, all because Caleb wouldn't let him use his wheelchair. Like if he used his wheelchair, he wouldn't have fallen. And it only gets worse from there. After like a couple more incidences, Caleb and Jude's relationship kind of just fizzles out and they stop talking. And one day Jude and Harold are out at dinner in a restaurant, and they come across a very drunk Caleb, and he says some very, very offside and rude things about Jude to Harold, and then they kind of all leave the restaurant, go about their way. And when Jude gets back home to his apartment, Caleb is there waiting for him because he had an extra key to the apartment. And this was very awful to read about because Caleb rapes Jude. He locks him out of the apartment building naked, like literally on the street, and gets him to beg him to let him back in. He gets Jude to repeat all of these awful things back to Caleb, like back to him, confirming all of Jude's worst nightmares. Like every insecurity Jude had about himself, Caleb magnified that night. He pushes him down the fire escape, and like Jude is laying there beaten and broken. Like he has a broken arm, broken ribs, his face is all swollen. He does end up back at Andy's, and only a few people see him in this state, but he is so embarrassed and feels like it's all of his fault, and that he's disgusting, he's worthless, he's ugly, he's deformed. Caleb just solidified all of this to him, and this was the first person Jude had a relationship and was interested in, and he thinks, well, this is what I deserve. Like when you're like me, this is what you get, which is very heartbreaking. And just wish, like you just want to like give Jude a hug and be like, no, it's like Caleb's the asshole, like you didn't deserve that, like you just found the wrong one, like of course. And then we move on to chapter 2, and this is from Harold's POV. We learn more about his son Jacob that he had with his ex-wife ex-wife Liesel, and his son died of a rare illness, and that kind of caused their separation. Honestly, those chapters are kind of boring to me. Like, I just want to learn more about Jude. I don't really care about the filler stuff, but anyways, I can see why they're important to get background of other characters and to round them out as well. Oh, this is a big one. This is chapter 3, and this is where we get to a lot of detail about Brother Luke and Jude's time with him. So I'm gonna be reading a lot from my phone because there is a lot that happens in this chapter. Like, it is heavy. So we start in the greenhouse with Brother Luke at the monastery, and it's Jude's birthday. I think he turned 8 that day, and we don't know a lot about Luke at this point, but he's pretty kind to Jude, and for his birthday, he brought him a muffin with a match in it to represent a birthday cake. And then Luke kind of goes on these stories to Jude about how they can run away from the monastery, how they can go live in a cabin in the woods, go camping, go to the beach, get ice cream, kind of just filling him with a bunch of empty promises. And then just before Easter, they actually do run away, and in like the middle of the night, Luke loads up Jude into his car and they just start driving. And this chapter is very long and a lot happens, but as I've mentioned before, the stories never come to a close in one telling, so I'm going to be kind of bouncing back and forth a little bit. I'm going to tell it how it happens in the chapter chronologically, not one story in its entirety. So the last part of that is Jude and Brother Luke take off from the monastery. We don't know where they're going. But then Willem is back in New York and knows something happened to Jude when, what's his name? Caleb. This is talking about the Caleb event. But Jude won't tell him any details. Like, I think it's only really Andy, Harold, and Lucian, and maybe Richard or someone. Like, only a very few people know about the Caleb incident, so Willem is kind of trying to pry about it, but he doesn't know how to go about talking to Jude about this, and Jude won't give up many details. And then he actually lives with Jude until Willem has to go film somewhere else in like Sri Lanka, I think. And all of Jude's past traumas are coming back to haunt him, and for a while he was pretty good at controlling them, like kind of forgetting about it, but now he doesn't have that same level of control as he once did. And this shame is consuming his entire life. Like, he can't go very long without feeling the embarrassment, the guilt, the shame, all of that. So he actually attempts suicide by like slitting his wrists. He has everything sorted out for work. Like, he has made lists on lists of things, like all of his cases, who they're supposed to be delegated to. He's written a bunch of letters to all of his loved ones. He's got his will up to date. Like, he has taken care of everything because he is literally preparing to die. Like, he thinks this will be his last hurrah, last moments on earth. Like, he wants to make sure everything is looked after and sorted. So back on the Brother Luke timeline, they have made their way to Texas and they're staying in a motel. And that is when Brother Luke begins to traffic Jude to men. Literally at 9 years old, he is being sold as a sex worker. Brother Luke also starts raping him and starts telling him like how much they love each other and that they are in love, and like telling him like he's like a son to Brother Luke, but also raping him and treating him like a lover. I use that term very loosely. It's disgusting. So he's just grooming Jude to the max and telling him like how great he is, how lovable he is, and like how perfect he is, but treating him like garbage. And then after Jude's suicide attempt, it was unsuccessful, so he's at the hospital for a long time. It's a very, very long road to recovery because he mutilated himself so badly. So Harold and Julia are staying with him. Willem has moved back into the apartment as well. Willem's birthday happens and Jude's like, what can I get you? Like, I want to get you something for your birthday, and he also wants to do it as a thank you for like taking care of him. And Willem has decided that he wants to know who Brother Luke is because Jude's having nightmares and screaming out like, help me, Brother Luke, help me, like talking about Brother Luke a lot. So Willem wants to know who he is, and that truth, those truths are what Jude can give him for his birthday. They start off very small because Jude's very intimidated by that. Like, that's a big secret and a big thing to unload. So they start small with like little truths here and there. And then back at the motel, Jude has turned 11. So they've been living there for about 2 years, I think a little bit over 2 years, where Jude has been sold as a sex worker and has been raped and beat by these grown-ass men. It's awful. It doesn't go into a lot of detail, but it goes into enough where you're very, very uncomfortable. And one night the police show up at their motel room. They have found them and they're there to arrest Brother Luke. But Brother Luke hightails it out of that bed, heads for the bathroom. The police barge into the room. They get to the bathroom and Brother Luke has hung himself, so he gone. I think I'm gonna end this video here because I still have like 40% of this book to read still, and it is heavy. Like, this is a library book, so I have to bring it back in a couple of days, so I'm probably gonna renew it, but it's just a lot, and this video is extremely long, so I'm gonna end this as part 1 here. So we covered parts 1 to 4, and I think there's just 5 and 6, maybe part 7 as well. Yeah, there are 7 parts to it. Parts 5, 6, and 7 will be in part 2 of this video, which I can't promise when that'll be up because this has taken me so long to get through. But I hope you enjoyed this video. If you have read A Little Life or you plan on it, please let me know down in the comments. Share your opinions and your thoughts on it. I would be very interested. I didn't cry reading this book yet. There is still a lot more to get through, but it never got me crying. So I don't know what that says about me. But anyways, thank you so much for watching this video, and I will see you guys in my next one. Bye!